in recent years on ecosystem services and developing the ecosystem service approach for DEFRA in the UK in valuing the impacts of air pollution on ecosystem services. And he's been developing ecosystem service models and also assessing trade-off in EU projects such as ROBIN, which is the role of biodiversity in climate change mitigation, and also in NERC projects such as BESS, biodiversity and ecosystem service sustainability. And he was also a coordinating lead author on one of the chapters in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. So he will now give a presentation on valuing valuing air pollution impacts on ecosystem services and gives a UK and European perspective. The floor is yours, Laurence.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. I'll just bring the presentation up. So this hopefully falls into one of the categories that Kurt described, which actually integrates biophysical elements with valuation. So this is perhaps, rather than a general discussion about some of the concepts, this is much more about application. Excuse me. This talks more about application of some of these ideas across a range of research projects we've been involved with within the UK, funded by Department of the Environment, and also in Europe, funded by as part of the ICP vegetation program that Harry mentioned. So take a step back and think about some of the impacts of air pollution on our wider environment. Perhaps the four biggest air pollutants that are affecting Europe at the moment are nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, and ozone. So these have a wide range of impacts. We're perhaps familiar with some of the impacts of ozone on agriculture, for example, reducing yield, but perhaps we're not so familiar with the idea that perhaps nitrogen is actually beneficial to agriculture in terms of providing free fertilizer. Sulfur perhaps has declined over recent years in terms of policy importance, but there was a big issue, as you'll remember, in the 1980s with acid rain, damaging tree growth, causing crown dieback. Lots of impacts of air pollutants on biodiversity, on plant species richness, on other species. Impacts on water quality, either through acidification or extra nutrients in the system, with potential knock-on effects for human health, for example, for dissolved organic carbon in water systems, linked to cancer. And then lastly, a more obvious human element, air pollution damage to buildings and the effect of particulates and aerosols on human health as well. So there's a wide range of impacts here, and typically these aren't really taken much note of. We're aware of them, but policy kind of pays lip service to those. Sort of bringing ecosystem services into the framework, it provides a way of capturing these wider benefits and costs to the way we view ourselves and what the environment provides us. So typically these aren't brought into economic analysis. Jackie mentioned this morning that health impacts have suddenly become very important. And one reason for that is that there's been a range of studies which have actually put a monetary value on the impact of particulates on human health. So suddenly that rocketed up the political agenda. The European Nitrogen Assessment was a large project that reported in the last year or so, and that calculated that excess nitrogen in the environment coming from agriculture costs Europe between 70 and 320 billion euros each year. So if we can find a way to monetize or certainly to quantify some of these impacts, and it's useful to do that within an ecosystem services framework, then one outcome of this is to produce damage costs, which can be used by policymakers in a range of other studies. If you like, it's a way of value transfer. So you can extrapolate the results of an impact from one study to other similar studies. And this is what we've tried to do. So I'm going to talk about the developing methodologies we've been involved with, giving some UK examples and then more wider European examples. Just to provide a bit of context on changes in air pollution, this shows changes in the major air pollutants from around the Second World War through to 2010, and then extrapolated to 2020, the last dots on the graph. So sulfur is the green line, and that peaked in the 1970s, and that's declined massively since then. It's declined by 90%, and that's a direct result of policy intervention to clean up power station emissions, change the type of fuels we use, etc. Nitrogen dioxides, the reddish-brown line, they peaked in around 1990, but they've also declined because of catalytic converters on vehicles, again, another policy intervention. Ammonia is the blue line, and despite various measures to try and reduce ammonia, that's still quite persistent because ammonia is lots of different scattered sources usually. It's quite difficult to control. And then lastly, ozone, the purple line, ozone concentrations continue to rise. The actual pattern of ozone changes, so large peak episodes are declining, but the background concentrations are rising. So generally, nitrogen and sulfur are going down, but ozone's still going up. One way of looking at the impacts of air pollution is to follow what's called the impact pathway. And what this does is it sets out in steps how a change in a policy might influence a particular sector that emits pollutants, and how that feeds through the chain of impact right the way through to people and to a value, be it monetary or non-monetary. So pollutants are emitted by a sector. You then have to model where those pollutants go and how they're deposited, and then what the impacts are on the environment in terms of dose-response functions for impacts on soils, on plants, on water chemistry, and then how that might impact on the ecosystem services which the environment provides for us. And then lastly, translating that into some value of impact. Now, because this is a long chain of events, each of these arrows, each step in the chain requires some kind of quantification, some knowledge, a dose-response function in order to complete that chain. So if any of these bits are missing, you can't get through to the end of the chain. And the ecosystem services approach generally tends to focus on these aspects. It's the changes to the environment caused by air pollution, and then how we translate that to ecosystem services and value it. I was talking about these dose-response functions and the links in the chain. In order to make some of these links active, we really need to understand how the systems work. So this is a bit of a complex diagram. Don't pay too much attention to the detail, but what it illustrates is one of the tricky parts of the link, which is linking all the kind of environmental research we've been doing for the past 10, 20, 30 years on, for example, air pollution impacts on soils and waters and carbon and nitrogen cycling within those, but actually making the conceptual links from individual parts of that system through to particular ecosystem services. So the ecosystem services are in boxes around the edge with the blue arrows linking the individual components to them. But that's quite challenging, and we need to understand precisely how those links work in order to be able to get from the change in ecosystem function through to the change in service. The next step, which is equally tricky, is the valuation. And I'm just going to talk about some of the examples I've been involved with. But typically the approaches we've used are looking at valuing the goods and benefits that we get from final ecosystem services. So that's to avoid double counting issues. And just to stress that there's no single approach to valuation. And the valuation approach has to be sensitive to the type of ecosystem service and the most appropriate method. So we use a range of market prices, shadow prices, through to contingency valuation, willingness to pay. I should also add that most of the valuation work that we've been involved with has been done in collaboration with FTech. You'll be hearing from Etche later, not on this issue. So, policy questions. How can we use this in a policy context? Well, typically the two approaches that have been taken so far are to ask two very subtly different policy questions. So most of the work we've done for the UK has asked, if we implement a policy to reduce emissions from a particular sector, what will be the impact over a set period of time compared to if we didn't do anything? So what's the long-term impact? Another approach, which has perhaps been dominant in the European work that we've been involved with, is to look at what's the sort of, if you compare the impact of, say, ozone in a particular year, what loss have we got in terms of wheat yield, for example, compared to if there wasn't any ozone pollution at all? So it's asking a different question. They're both valid policy questions, but the approach that you take to answer those is slightly different. So just to provide a little bit more detail about the approach that we've taken for UK work, you have this tracks the change in nitrogen deposition over time, this graph, and using 2007 as the reference year, we then look forward to 2020 and say, in one scenario, we're reducing emissions under the UEP 43 energy scenario, and nitrogen deposition is going to go down. And the reference scenario says we maintain emission levels at 2007 levels. And you make this comparison through the process. You build in discounting, and you come to a sort of economic estimate of net damage at the end of it. So I'm just going to provide a few examples of how we've done this for different pollutants in the UK, and then move on to European examples. So just using an example of sulfur impacts on methane emissions, you need a dose-response function, which we've got on the left. And this shows that actually sulfur deposition has been suppressing methane emissions. So if we're dropping sulfur, then actually we're leading to increased methane emissions. So this is, if you like, a sort of negative consequence of cleaning up sulfur pollution. And we've worked out, using this economic approach, that comes to an equivalent annual value of about £1.1 million in the UK. So that's looking at changes. That's actually a historical study. So looking at changes from 1987 to 2007, that drop in sulfur. That was a fairly simplistic approach where we looked at average sulfur deposition across the UK, average methane emission factors from bogs. We've done much more development of the methodologies, so I'm going to give an example for ozone impacts on a provisioning service, on lamb production. The lamb industry is worth about 1 billion to the UK economy each year. Ozone affects pasture quality in terms of yield and the chemical constituents of the forage quality, such that you get a reduction in metabolizable energy of the pasture. So there's two ways of valuing this. One is to say the lambs are a lower sale weight, so you get a lower price for them. But in reality, farmers just make up that feed in terms of added concentrate. So perhaps a more realistic way is to cost the added concentrate that farmers use to fatten the lambs. So as you move down in terms of pasture quality, you have to add more concentrate. Just to provide a sort of spatial context to the evaluation and why this is important, the map on the left shows ozone concentrations in 2007. Red values are high. So in this particular year, values were higher up in North Scotland and Southwest England. Projecting that to 2020, the middle graph shows the change in ozone concentrations over that comparison, and the increases in ozone are higher in the south and east. And then the last map shows where the lambs are, which isn't in the south and east. So you've got upland and lowland lambs, but generally they're higher in northern England and Wales, as you'd expect, Wales being well known for its sheep. So we value the change in concentrate that's required and calculate that spatially and then sum it across the UK to get to a relatively small figure for the impact of ozone on lambs of 192,000. it represents an extra cost to farmers across the UK. Those were two relatively easy things to value. How do we value cultural services? Particularly a cultural service which we've defined as appreciation of biodiversity. We've got two species here, redback shrike and petalwort, which is a tiny little liverwort. You almost need a hand lens to see it. They're both red data book species. Which one's more important? Are they equal in value? The public probably wouldn't agree, and they would say, the shrike is a nice charismatic species. We want to protect that. We're willing to pay more to protect the shrike. And the petalwort probably falls into clearly a non-charismatic species. How do we go about quantifying this impact for a cultural service? Well, actually, it's only relatively recent that we've got robust scientific evidence for impacts of nitrogen on some of these biodiversity metrics. So we've got lots of data on plant species richness now from carefully designed studies across the UK for a range of habitats. And if you know this, so this is plant species richness against nitrogen deposition in heathlands. And because it's a non-linear relationship, depending on where you are, a 5 kilogram drop in nitrogen might give you a different change in species richness on the graph. And we've got these response functions for a whole set of habitats, which together comprise about 30% of UK semi-natural habitats. And we can then model the change in species richness, which you'd get if you decreased nitrogen deposition for these habitats. How do we value that? Well, we're really lucky in having an experiment done by Mike Christie in Aberystwyth, which conducted a choice experiment to see how much people were willing to pay to maintain a whole set of ecosystem services in protected areas. So that produced willingness to pay values for carbon sequestration, flooding, for example, but also maintaining species populations. And we were able to link changes in what people were willing to pay to the scenarios we were looking at in our study to come up with a total value of, I've converted these to euros, just for the European audience, of around 30 million, an equivalent annual value. So dropping nitrogen deposition in the UK for this particular ecosystem service leads to an annual benefit of around 30 million euros. Now there's a whole bunch of caveats associated with this, of course. Some of these might lead to an underestimate, and some of these suggest that actually this is an overestimate. Perhaps the most important is that the response functions we've got are for non-charismatic species. The valuation study also provides valuation for charismatic species. We don't have those response functions for those, but if we did, then the value, the impact of that might be an extra factor of 5 higher, and that would be on top of the value for non-charismatic species. So we're only really valuing part of the story here, even with all this data and information. So just to summarize the UK experience in terms of modeling impacts, this shows what we've been able to do so far. Again, don't take too much notice of the detail, but you've got the 3 main pollutants there, nitrogen, sulfur, and ozone. And probably the striking thing is all the NVs, that's the not valued. Now that's either because there's evidence gaps in the environmental science or in the valuation. For those ones where we did get a valuation, a lot of them are only partial. So we're really only telling part of the story. But even with that part of the story, this is a quick summary for the impact of nitrogen. Most of the services that we could value fall below the line. And because they're the provisioning services, they're the ones with market values which are easy to value. The few that we were able to do for the cultural services, particularly the biodiversity, fall above the line. So if we miss out biodiversity, if we say we shouldn't or we can't value that, then actually the economic picture we get is that declining nitrogen pollution is bad for economics. It represents a cost in terms of timber production, for example. So there are dangers in not going down this route, but there's also a lot of arguments about whether you should value impacts on biodiversity or not. So some of this work is published in a recent paper in Ecosystem Services. And I'll now go on to describe some of the work where we've been doing similar things, mainly involved in the ICP program that Harry and Gina Mills are working in, looking at these, valuing things on a European scale for ecosystem services. A lot of the focus for this has been on food security. So a lot of work on ozone. Ozone reduces the yield of a whole bunch of crops that produces visible injury to salad crops, for example, which means that you can't market them. So there's a definite impact, economic impact of ozone in that context. And this report describes impacts on a range of sensitive and moderately sensitive species, one of which is wheat. And there's been work done under the ICP vegetation to basically model the impact of ozone on wheat in Europe. So combining information about where wheat is grown, what the yield, the potential yield is in each area, a dose response function in terms of how much ozone is taken up by the plants and how it affects wheat growth and wheat yield, and then producing a map of ozone impacts across Europe. And because wheat's relatively easy to value, this has been taken forward to valuation, and it's shown that in the year 2000, across the whole of Europe, there's an estimated impact of ozone in terms of 3.2 billion euros of loss in yield, which is a pretty hefty sum. And the impacts are greater in sort of France and Germany and parts of the UK. The same study also looked at what the potential impacts on yield would be in 2020, and under this particular scenario, the ozone flux goes down, and so the net loss goes down, but it's still 2 billion euros. The ICP vegetation work has also looked at some of the other ecosystem services, not yet taken through to valuation, but certainly calculating the biophysical impact in great spatial detail across Europe. So this report describes impacts on carbon sequestration in woodlands, and it calculates that ozone reduces carbon sequestration in tree biomass by 14%. And because it reduces tree growth and reduces stomatal uptake, then there's knock-on effects on climate functioning as well. And ozone itself is actually a greenhouse gas. So if stomata take up less ozone, there's more ozone in the atmosphere. So there's further knock-on effects on climate regulation. And then lastly, looking at nitrogen impacts on biodiversity at a European scale. It builds on similar approaches to the ones I described earlier, where there's dose-response relationships for nitrogen and plant species richness. And then modeling under different emission scenarios how those might change in the future. So in this case, red is bad. Red indicates a suppression of the potential species richness in an area. So as you move forward under different emission scenarios, where you actually implement nitrogen emission controls, then the amount of red declines and basically you get, in principle, higher species richness. So just to conclude, ecosystem service frameworks provide a powerful way of integrating these sort of wider impacts of air pollution, and to a certain extent being able to value those and putting them into an economic context for policymakers. And if we're able to get to the end part of the chain, which is providing a damage cost, then that can be used in policy appraisal to evaluate other studies. But quantification and valuation require multidisciplinary teams. You need environmental scientists to talk to economists, to talk to social scientists, and there's a huge body of evidence needed to fill this chain all the way through. And because of this complexity, there remain major knowledge gaps, both in the environmental side and also the value transfer side, particularly for cultural services. So, there's a lot of really interesting work going on, but there's still a long way to go to be able to provide a definitive picture of air pollution impacts on ecosystem services. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence, for this nice overview of